There's an English idiom that is often used to criticize someone's perspective on an issue. We say that they can't see the forest for the trees. This means that they can't see the big picture because they're too focused on the specific details. I think this phrase applies nicely to SAT grammar, especially questions involving different verb forms. Some people get so carried away with the specific types and tenses of verbs that they miss how those verbs affect the big picture structure of the sentence. If you start categorizing every verb as finite, non-finite, transitive, intransitive, gerunds, and participles, you're going to lose your grasp on what's actually happening inside of the sentence. Our goal in this lesson is to stay focused on the big picture sentence structure, and we'll categorize verbs in very simple ways based on how they look, specifically whether the verb starts with the word to or ends with the letters ing. But remember that not every SAT verb tense question will be about this to and ing rule. Watch my verb tense lesson to learn how to recognize the 3 different verb tense rules. In this case, the obvious to and ing answer choices would tell us that this question is probably about how the verb affects the sentence structure. Let's read the sentence with the correct answer, choice A, and see how it sounds. Some legal experts who cite the 14th Amendment's Due Process Clause argue that the Bill of Rights applies to the states. To me, this just sounds right. The sentence sounds complete. Let's compare it to choice B with the to form of the verb, and try to listen very carefully to how my voice sounds at the end of the sentence. Some legal experts who cite the 14th Amendment's Due Process Clause to argue that the Bill of Rights applies to the states. Did you hear it? I can hear that my voice goes up at the end, as if I'm expecting more words at the end of the sentence. Choice B makes it sound like the sentence stops too soon. It's incomplete. Choice C with ing has the same problem. Some legal experts who cite the 14th Amendment's Due Process Clause, arguing that the Bill of Rights applies to the states. The best way to understand what's happening here is to look at a very similar question. In fact, the only difference is that I deleted the word who from the beginning, and now choice B is actually correct. Some legal experts cite the 14th Amendment's Due Process Clause to argue that the Bill of Rights applies to the states. Sounds good, right? Well, let's change the sentence one more time. For this third example, all I've done is add a comma right before the blank. Everything else is the same, except for the correct answer, which is now choice C. Some legal experts cite the 14th Amendment's Due Process Clause, arguing that the Bill of Rights applies to the states. So what's going on here? How is it possible that SAT questions that are almost identical have completely different correct answers? Well, as I said at the beginning, it comes down to sentence structure. The to and ing versions of a verb aren't powerful enough to anchor a sentence on their own. In example 1, argue is the main verb. Some legal experts argue. The word who starts off an extra clause that describes the experts. We could cut that clause out and still have a complete sentence. But in example 2, the loss of the word who makes cite the main verb. So the core sentence is now, some legal experts cite the 14th Amendment's Due Process Clause. The use of the word to allows us to continue the thought, adding extra information that sounds like an action, but is really more of a description. We often use the to form for the second verb in a linked pair. In example 3, the comma is a very clear indicator that we've added an extra clause to the end of our sentence, and ing verbs are great for starting out extra comma clauses. The main sentence is the same as it was in example 2. Some legal experts cite the 14th Amendment's Due Process Clause. In fact, this is why many to and ing SAT questions are actually about punctuation. Examples 2 and 3 say the exact same thing, but to verbs don't usually get commas, while ing verbs often do get commas. It really comes down to the structure of the sentence, and unfortunately there are infinite ways to build sentences in English, so there aren't many absolute rules we can follow for this SAT grammar rule. But let's try to get a few general guidelines. Here are 2 strategies that are a bit contradictory. First, it's very important that you read the entire sentence. Here's an example of what can happen if we only read the words near the blank. It sounds very obvious that choice A is correct. Her works retell the plots of classic novels. If we back up a little further, it still sounds fine. Emojis in her works retell the plots of classic novels. But if we go back to the beginning, it completely changes our answer to choice B. Author Jean Vesuvius uses only emojis in her works to retell the plots of classic novels. The blank now represents the second verb in the sentence, so we should use the to form. In my experience, cutting the sentence too short is the main reason why students get the to and ing questions wrong. However, we often need to cut the sentence down so that we can hear the structure better. Try using this hierarchy so that you don't lose out on parts that are essential. First, get rid of any extra sentences. If we're interested in sentence structure, then we should stick to the sentence with the blank. That includes getting rid of the opposite side of compound sentences with semicolons, colons, dashes, and conjunctions like and. Watch my lessons on all of these punctuation marks to better understand how they join sentences together. Second, get rid of obvious extra clauses that interrupt a sentence. Double dashes and parentheses are the most obvious. You should also learn to recognize appositives, which typically give extra descriptions using 2 commas. Clauses that start with a comma and which are also extra attachments to a sentence. If you still can't figure out the overall sentence structure, then start removing extra descriptions like adjectives, prepositional phrases, and clauses that start with that. You typically won't see commas with these descriptions, so you'll need to have a good sense for what can be cut. At some point, you should reveal how the blank relates to the main sentence. Let's practice this. This sentence doesn't have a blank, but let's see how we would cut out the extra parts to get to the core sentence. First, we should recognize that the comma and the word and let us connect two complete sentences. If the blank were in the yellow, we would be able to ignore everything before the and. Instead, let's ignore the yellow and focus on the first sentence. Next, it's relatively easy to eliminate the double dash interruption. It's also easy to get rid of the which clause at the beginning, which is clearly marked with two commas. The sentence also starts with an ing word and a separate comma clause. You can see that there's already not much left to this sentence. If we needed to keep going, we could get rid of adjectives like various and three-dimensional. The word that often marks the beginning of an extra clause that we might be able to ignore. By now, if the blank were here, we would hopefully be able to hear that we need the main verb employs. The to and ing versions wouldn't work here because they'd create sentence fragments. A simple version of the main sentence is, crystallography employs techniques to map the structures. We've cut out a lot of details, but we've kept the main structure. In other words, we've chopped down a lot of trees, but we still have a forest. On the other hand, if the blank were over here, we would know that we need the to verb because map is the secondary verb in the pair. If we had crossed out employs though, then we might think that the sentence says crystallography maps the structures. So you can see how easy it can be to cut too much. Sometimes an extra part contains the blank. Here, we would need the ing form because we're adding a comma clause onto the main sentence. The United Nations recognized the field's importance. We also have an ing comma clause at the beginning of the sentence, and it functions the same way, adding extra info to our main sentence. But within the extra which clause, we have a verb without the to or ing. That's because which clauses typically need a primary verb. Actually, the main verb for the which clause is the verb is, right next to it. Explores is the main verb of the that clause, so that's within our which clause. We have another that clause later on that also uses the main verb form, but notice that immediately after it is the to form. What this clause is technically saying here is materials engineers use the structures to design new products and technologies. As you can see, the to and ing rule is complicated. There are so many possibilities and the SAT can throw all sorts of question varieties at you. Try to be as flexible as possible and listen as best you can for the underlying structure of the sentence. Remember that even just a comma can completely change the correct answer. Let's finish up with the final review of how you should handle the to and ing questions. First, you have to make sure that the question is actually testing this grammar rule before you get carried away breaking the sentence apart. Many questions with verbs in the answer choices will be about singular and plural verbs, or past, present, and future tenses. Make sure you watch my lesson on how to identify each type of verb tense question. But if the answer choices seem to include the to and ing versions of a verb, then you're probably going to need to think about the sentence structure. As contradictory as it sounds, you need to make sure you read everything so that you comprehend the big picture sentence structure. But you also need to remove extra pieces of the sentence so that you can figure out how the blank relates to the whole. Cut down some trees, but preserve the forest. And as we saw, the rules for each verb form can be complicated, but we generally need a primary verb to anchor a sentence. The subject will do that action. Which and that clauses also use primary verbs in most cases. The to and ing verbs are typically secondary. They follow the main verb to add extra description, or they start extra comma clauses. But try your best to listen for the answer. You don't often get these rules wrong when you speak, so trust how the choices sound when you read them in your head. And luckily, the to and ing rule only comes up once or twice on each SAT, so it's not very many points. The other grammar rules, including the other two verb tense rules, are much more straightforward, so prioritize locking them down. And when the to and ing does come up, I hope I've given you a few good strategies to make them easier to solve. Thanks for watching!